Okay, welcome everybody. Seems we're getting everybody here into the room. Welcome on YouTube. See you there too. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I think the ticker is slowing down. Great. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome again. I'm Michelle Jewell from the Department of Applied Ecology at NC State University. Almost forgot my own name there. That goes to show you what the week's like. But anyway, welcome again to another edition of Fermentology. For those of you who are new, our Fermentology series is a mini seminar series based on the culture, science, history of everyday fermented foods. And if you don't already know, if you haven't been a long-time follower, we've had guests from everywhere on the planet join us on a semi-weekly basis since April last year. And all the recordings for those previous talks are available on our YouTube page. Just go to YouTube and search Fermentology, or go to YouTube and search Applied Ecology, and you'll find the Fermentology videos on our channel. And today we have two extremely special guests. We're joined by Applied Ecology's own and Fermentology co-founder, Professor Rob Dunn. And we have archaeologist and best-selling author, Wragg Sykes, with us too. They're going to be chatting with us about where deliciousness, which is Rob's work, and Neanderthals, which is Becky's work, intersect. And Rob, who along with Monica Sanchez has written Delicious, I'm going to throw a link into the chats towards that book so you can check that out. And Wragg Sykes has just published her new best-selling account of the latest information about Neanderthals in Kindred, and I'm going to put a link to Kindred into the chats as well. Now, as always, we will have a live Q&A at the end of their conversation. So whether you're watching on Zoom or if you're in the YouTube room, use whatever chat box is available to you and you can throw your questions in there. And at the end of the talk, I'll filter through the questions and ask as many as I can. Of course, just by the sheer volume of people and questions and interest, I won't be able to get to everybody's questions today, but both Rob and Becky are easy to find on the internet, so you'll be able to ask them there. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Rob and Becky. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.
Hey, Becky, I'm really looking forward to talking about deliciousness in Neanderthals and food in Neanderthals. I've been storing up questions for months. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be part of the seminar series.
So I wanted to start with sort of some background. So when we think about Neanderthals, can you tell us a little bit about how we know what we know about what they ate and how that changed through time? What kinds of evidence do we now have? And maybe also frame a little bit what time periods we're talking about.
Yes, so for Neanderthals, they're obviously, people think of them, that's the Stone Age, but they're not super old. So we're not talking like 3 million years. For Neanderthals, we're really sort of beginning around 350, maybe 400,000 years ago, and they continue through to about 40,000 years, and then we don't see them anymore in the archaeological record. And they lived through a lot of different climates, so super cold, as people might expect with Ice Age animals, but also what we call interglacial periods, just like we're in now, with forests, and it could be warm in the summer and things like this. So they had very varied worlds. But what we understand about how they survived in terms of their diet and what they ate is actually one of the things that has really changed massively in the 170 odd years since we first discovered Neanderthals. And that's partly to do with sort of expanding what we understand in terms of, like, as I was talking about, the climates that they lived in, and so our expectations of the things they might eat. But it's much more to do with how archaeology as a discipline has actually just, exponentially grown, and it's matured, not only for the specific sort of funky techniques that we have now. There's just millions of different ways we can analyze the stuff we dig, but also how we excavate. So now we understand, that you can't just pull out the big exciting bones from a site and assume that, oh, well, Neanderthals definitely are responsible for those animals, because you have to look at the surface of the bones and see, are there cut marks or are there marks from other carnivores, and then you can work out, you know, who's responsible for accumulating the bones and loads of things like that. So it's about how archaeology works as a discipline as well, and that has led to a much better understanding that Neanderthals were actually very diverse in what they ate.
And so is there something like a characteristic diet of a Neanderthal day in any, I mean, maybe choose a place and time, like what would a day in Neanderthal dining look like?
I think anywhere in time or space where they were alive, meat absolutely is going to be a key part of that. And you know, there's plenty of caveman cliches in terms of pop culture thought about Neanderthals, and you know, you might imagine them hunting something large and then dragging back sort of a haunch of meat or whatever. But the place of meat in their diet was a bit more subtle than that. So what we can see is that they definitely were able to hunt really big creatures, including mammoths, elephants, rhinoceros, really big horses, bigger than the ones that you see in like cave art much later. But they also were going after medium-sized game like deer, and small game as well, rabbits, birds, things like that. So the range of what they ate was large, but anywhere they were living, they were getting the best out of their local environment. So in terms of whatever meat was around, whether you know you were in Germany 70,000 years ago and there's a lot of reindeer around, or maybe Spain, say 50,000 years ago, you would be going after boar and red deer instead, because it's wooded environments. But wherever you are, what we can see is that they not only hunted animals, but they were really quite selective. They would go after the prime-aged animals, basically the ones that had the best energy return for effort. And also, once they actually killed animals, we can see that they were really systematic in how they butchered them. So, you know, as a lot of people who are into cooking know, some animals have very lean meat, and you need to supplement that with fat, especially for Neanderthals who had intensive lifestyles and used up a load of calories all the time. And we see this, that they were not just going after, you know, the lean meat on any carcass. They were really going for, you know, the offal, the brains, and especially the marrow, all the fatty stuff. So wherever you are in any Neanderthal world, that's going to be a key part of food on any particular day. But what they actually ate each day was probably really, really variable, depending on whether they were moving between sites, the season as well, really important. So it could be probably something completely different for breakfast one day, if they actually had any breakfast, because, you know, our ideas of when one has a meal are quite culturally specific.
But do you think they were mixing food items? Would they have been a little bit of deer with a berry? Or, I mean, do we know anything about that? Or do we imagine that food items were eaten individually, like we see with some hunter-gatherers today?
That's a good question. And I don't think there is any evidence directly for any mixed food items. Like, we haven't found like a smear of sauce, you know, with two different ingredients. But we do know that they did understand about mixing substances, and they had recipes of other material. So we can see that they made pigment mixes, for example, with 2 or 3 different ingredients, different kinds of pigment, and like crushed up rock. And also when they, in some sites, we can see Neanderthals were not just making tools out of stone, but they had multi-component tools where you'd have stone stuck onto like a wooden handle, and the adhesive that they used for that, we have a site in Italy that was relatively recently found where they are mixing a conifer resin with beeswax. So they understand the concept of mixing 2 different materials for a new sort of result. So I don't see why not.
I mean, in your sort of personal relationship with Neanderthals, do you imagine flavor is obviously the thing that Monica and I've been thinking about so much, and so it's like our biased perspective on the whole world. But
no, I love that about the book. It's brilliant.
oh, thank you. Do you imagine the Neanderthals putting flavor first sometimes? Did they care about flavor? Or do you think it figured into choices?
Oh yeah, I mean, as you know, as you guys argue in the book, flavor and deliciousness or whatever, it's basic survival. It's about being a creature with a body with senses and the ability to have emotional reactions to your engagement with the world. So it would surprise me if Neanderthals didn't do what we see plenty of other animals do, which is focus on things that make them feel good. You know, whether that's basic stuff like you don't like being cold, so you wrap your body, you protect your body, and also you don't like eating stuff that's bad for your body. That's, as you know, with all the taste receptor, sort of the amazing stuff we understand about how taste actually works. It's about giving signals to your body as to what's good or not. And I'm certain that in amongst the range of things that they ate, there would have been preferred foods. Certainly fat, I think, would be a big part of that. You know, fatty foods are very attractive to us. You know, we like sweet things, but also fat actually just tastes good. And as I said earlier, if you are a hunter-gatherer, especially in environments where you're moving about a lot and you have a really energy intensive lifestyle, you can't survive off lean meat or, you know, plants. You just can't get enough carbs. You have to have a lot of fat. And I would think that given that we see from the patterning in how Neanderthals are selecting different species between different sites, as well as how we can see that they really carefully chose the parts that they butchered and then took away from their kill sites, that they would have focused in on the parts that were most valuable to them. And taste must have been an element of that. I mean, there have been some sort of suggestions with particular species like elephants have been discussed in terms of their place in human evolution, and the fact, you know, hunting elephants is intimidating and not easy, but they give a good return, obviously, in terms of the amount of meat you get, but also they're supposed to taste pretty good, and like particular parts of them, like their foot pads are supposed to be really quite succulent. And also there's this cool research that was done looking at baby mammoths, and it would appear that baby mammoths were super enriched with fatty acids because of the mother's milk, and so maybe baby mammoths tasted especially succulent. And there is a site, a Spee Cave, where it looks like Neanderthals were potentially targeting infant mammoths, which is hard because they are very strongly defended by the members of the elephant of the mammoth herd. So that's really interesting, and there are pointers towards sort of particular selection of species across different sites. Sometimes it makes sense just because of the environment. Other times, you know, you might see one site with loads of rabbits and another site in a really similar environment, and they're not doing that. So is that seasonal, or is it something about preference?
I mean, we love the Mammoth and Mastodon flavor. I mean, we talk about it a great deal, and Ram Barkai's work on this is really interesting. One of the things that's always fascinated me is a lot of the later cave art, you know, ancient modern humans, not Neanderthals, where you get baby mammoths that look very realistic, but then they have these giant feet.
Yes.
And it's like,
balloon foot.
Is this just a menu? Like, is this just, oh, you know, like, look at the baby mammoth and then the feet taste so good.
Yeah.
But to go back to one of your other points, Becky, about this variation from place to place, one of the things I became obsessed about when running Delicious was this issue that if you look from chimpanzee population to chimpanzee population, that you see differences in their culinary traditions, some of which seem to relate to their environment. So if you live in a savanna, you do different things than if you're in a forest. But you also see differences that don't seem to relate to the environment. And so at Gombe, where Jane Goodall worked, the chimpanzees eat two species of ants, and at Mahale, which is just 70 kilometers away, same basic habitat, they ate totally different species of ants, and that's persisted for almost 50 years now. And so those look, in the chimpanzee literature, they really look like culinary traditions that are not adaptive. They have to do with what your people do, in the Southern way of using that word, in this case for chimps. Do you see any evidence that some of the culinary differences among Neanderthal populations don't just relate to the environment, but that they might instead relate to traditions? Is there any way we would know?
It's really hard to say that for sure with Neanderthals, largely because the timescales that we deal with are obviously different. Like at Gombe, you can sit and watch chimps for 50 years and you see the generational changes and you can track that and that's one group. For Neanderthal sites, we are looking at particular points in the landscape which probably were at different sort of slices through time. Some of those were definitely connected to each other, but it's really difficult to kind of pull those out and say, oh yes, this is a site where we have a layer that's a meter thick and we have occupation phases through that layer, but is that the same group coming back through generations, or is that different groups using it for a while and then they go away and a completely different cultural group comes in? And we can unpick that a little bit with the stone tools. If technologically the stone tools don't change, then that kind of suggests maybe it is, but it's still really sort of, you have to be really cautious about it. But I think at a broad scale, there are maybe like two or three things that I think might jump out in terms of particularities. I already said that there are some sites in northern Spain where there's a lot of red deer hunting that goes on, and as I mentioned before, at one of these sites there's quite a lot of rabbit eating, no birds, but the other site there's none. There's no real small game at all. It doesn't look like necessarily the time of year was that different that they were being occupied, and yet there is a wildcat that's eaten in one phase of this site. So chronologically they're not exactly the same, but there's definite different focuses, and that might be to do with traditions, just what is done, as you mentioned. Another nice one that's kind of weird is there's another Spanish site called Cova Negra, where there's a lot of birds that are eaten, loads of different kinds of birds, not many of them, but a variety of them, and they're quite small, sort of like magpies and European rollers and partridge and things like this. But there's also a few really tiny birds like blackbirds or swifts, and we can see butchering on those birds, on like their legs. And this doesn't look like a site where Neanderthals were like starving and they were forced to eat that. So is that because that's just what Neanderthals there did? I mean, I was wondering, and I sort of muse on it in the book, that maybe this is something to do with how hunting is learned. If you look at some ethnographic contexts, small bird hunting is one thing that children do. Because it's easy, they can go off, they can find the little birds, trap them, and they can learn butchery that way. So maybe weird things are also connected to sort of the social context and who's actually doing the hunting and the gathering and the going out, and who is where in the landscape, and their skill level. But the other one I was thinking of is tortoises. As I was saying previously, Neanderthals did live in a range of environments, some of them warm and dry, including in the Mediterranean, and then you get tortoises because that's native species. And there are actually quite a few sites with tortoises. In some of them, they seem to be really quite a focus. Like there's a cave from Portugal, Gruta de Oliveira, I think you pronounce it. And sort of through multiple levels, there's at least 80 tortoises that have been, butchered and taken. And there is some evidence from that site that they were actually overhunting and that the size of the tortoises through time as you go up gets smaller because they're not getting enough time to, breed and grow to their proper size. So that's interesting. There's this tortoise thing, but also at that site and various other sites where we see tortoises in the Mediterranean, there seems to be a common way of cooking them. You sort of flip them upside down and roast them in the shell, and then you can tear off the legs. It sounds a bit gory, and slice out the meat and stuff. So, is that actually a tradition? When we're actually talking about different peninsulas of land as well, in the Mediterranean, it's very hard to say. Or maybe they're just hitting on things that make sense, and that's how you cook a tortoise. And maybe that's one thing that Neanderthals from different parts of the Mediterranean, if they met, would say, "Oh, I know how to do that. We do that too."
I will say that the tortoise section of the book was one of those. There are a bunch of places in the book where, like, I took the book around and said, "Oh, you got to look at this. This is crazy." But the tortoise section is one where I did that, and then I texted people, and then I took a picture of it, and I sent out emails. The book is wonderful, but it has these things that, even though I've been thinking about Neanderthals and writing and just thinking about this material, that are just totally new and it hadn't occurred to me at all. But the tortoises was for sure one of those. So switching a little bit, so you mentioned the cooking the tortoises. As I understand it, there are these phases and places where it looked clearly like Neanderthals are cooking, but then all other places and times where it's more ambiguous. What is your take on how consistently Neanderthals were controlling fire, and if they weren't always using it, why they weren't always using it?
Well, the issue about whether they could, it's about whether they could produce fire. So there is a particular phase, sort of about 80,000 years ago, when it's a glacial period, and there are some sites in France in particular where it's been pointed out that before and after this phase, there is a fair amount of charcoal and hearths and things, and then during this phase, when it's colder and you would think that there's going to be a lot of fire, there isn't a lot of evidence at all for it. And so it's been argued, well, did they actually not know how to make fire, and they just kind of like forgot how to do it, or there just weren't a lot of wildfires and so they couldn't collect it? Personally, I don't think it's that. I think there is enough evidence to show that they understood how to control fire in really quite a sophisticated way. And there's also evidence linked to sort of traces on stone tools themselves, which look a lot like they're being used to strike a light. So I don't really buy that. What I think might be happening is that the way they use their sites may have been changing during colder periods, and although it might not make sense, it's possible that what they were doing and where they're cooking things changes, and they're actually out in the landscape a lot more. This is a period when we see them doing a lot of reindeer hunting, for example. And also there are still indicators of the presence of fire during that period. So it's not that there's absolutely nothing. I think something else is going on. And basically, if you have fire at all, it's not that hard to move the fire from site to site. You can take embers with you and stuff. So I think what that does sort of highlight, though, is our assumptions about what is the correct way to eat something. And eating food raw, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that in principle. And even frozen foods, there are cultures that live up in the Arctic in super high latitudes. There are culinary traditions of storing fish, in water, and it freezes and you just eat it straight out, and that's what you do, and it's tasty. If that's what you grew up with, that's tasty. So I think we should expect that there would have been variety. Probably not everything was being like roasted on like a barbecue in the way that people might think. The possibility of foods being boiled or stewed, I think, is certainly something that would make sense, for the fact that across so many Neanderthal sites, with the presence of a lot of meat, what we also see, especially at living sites, where not the killing sites, not the processing sites where they then take the carcass apart, but where they take all the good stuff, you see like bone completely smashed up, pulverized, and it's the marrow that they want. And we can even pick out in sort of micro layers next to hearths, you can see like sort of fatty stuff dripping, and maybe it's to do with the way that they're processing marrow that involves boiling as well. And you can actually get quite a lot of goodness even out of bone splinters by boiling it. And the people always say, well, how did Neanderthals boil stuff if they didn't have pots? But it is possible to do that. You can use natural containers, like you can actually do it with a skull, for example, as a bowl. You can
We're
boil
not
in.
recommending that to anyone.
No, food safety. But you can do it with like stone. There's native indigenous American traditions of using bark containers to boil in, and the principle is you just don't let the flames get higher than the liquid, basically. So you can use animal stomachs too. And we do have evidence from a Neanderthal from the Near East, from a site called Shanidar, where like a lot of other Neanderthals, when we've looked at like the grot in between their teeth, the calculus, we can pick out little micro remains of food, and that includes things like date palms or plants from the vetch family, but in particular sometimes we see starch from grass seeds. And in this individual from Shanidar, it looks as if the starch grains have been cooked by being boiled, not dry heated. So that is one of the best pieces of evidence we have that there was some kind of knowledge of how to actually, use water as a means to cook.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, so you raised this issue of killing mammoths and killing elephants, and this is a fermentology series, so it seems good to bring it back around to the ferment. And as you know, Dan Fisher has at University of Michigan has argued that maybe mastodons were fermented by Clovis people, that they were butchered and then put in ponds, and that this would have been a way to store them up, to keep them away from scavengers, and to eat them fermented for many months. I guess there are two questions around this. One is sort of broadly, what do you imagine Neanderthals doing in those cases when they have surplus food? And so you kill a mammoth, you kill an elephant. What do you do with that extra, or can you really eat all of it? And then is it possible that fermentation was part of their repertoire? And what would we look for if that were the case?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different threads to that. One is that, sure, if you put in a lot of effort to hunt massive creatures and then really carefully butcher them, it does seem a bit mad to then kind of not use all that abundance that you've just worked hard to get. And what we can see from the archaeology is that there is a separation in space between the places that things are killed and initially butchered, and then some of the the rubbish that they don't want, sort of the backbones and stuff, are left there generally. Then they take the good stuff, and they might secondarily process that at another place before taking it onwards, or sometimes it goes straight from the kill site to another to a living site. So there's definitely some staging in what happens to their food. And also we can see that it's not like a free-for-all. It's not like a load of hyenas at a kill site just like fighting each other to get to it. Everyone's slashing it up with their hand axes or whatever. It's really systematic, and it's very selective. So in that context, the idea that Neanderthals might try to store or move onwards the food that they have got, several days, weeks beyond, it would make sense in how they just behave generally. They are after quality, they understand economics in that sense, but we don't have any direct evidence for that. Like a lot of the ways of storing food, like if you make jerky, you're just wind drying it, you're just not going to see that archaeologically. Right. It's really, really difficult. you know, even like making pemmican type mixes. Again, that comes back to the question, have we got any recipes, have we got any mixes of stuff in here where we haven't for food? Not really. But in terms of possibilities, you know, can we see context, for example, like where you're talking about using water bodies to ferment, where you store the carcass underwater and the oxygen can't get to it and it keeps, you know, for shockingly long amounts of time. There are some contexts where we can see animal carcasses were underwater while they were, you know, being butchered, or at least partly submerged. So there's a site in the UK called Linford, where Neanderthals came back to. It was just in an open plain, sort of a bend in a river, nothing special, but over time at least 11 mammoth carcasses were there, and we believe those were being butchered, although there's no actual cut marks on them because mammoths and elephants are very, you know, thick fleshed and you don't necessarily get the cut marks. But Neanderthals were definitely there. They were making and sharpening their tools in that river channel. And so if those carcasses were underwater and they were coming back over time, that might make sense as a fermentation site. And we can see, like, from the insect remains that there definitely was, like, you know, some flesh was exposed, but some wasn't. And other sites as well, like there is a really amazing hunting site from an early Neanderthal context called Schöningen in Germany. It's about 330,000 years old. And that's awesome because it's a lake shore, and it has spears. So it has multiple beautiful spears, which look as if they were actually intended for throwing. And it's a place where Neanderthals came back to possibly over a century, maybe just a few decades, but repeatedly hunting horses. And there are at least 50 horses remains of along this lakeshore, but also in the water. So they probably were ambushing the horses, driving them into the water, because these were huge. They were like slightly bigger than thoroughbreds. They were massive creatures, and you can disadvantage horses in water quite easily. But you would think that you would drag or float the carcass right onto the shore, but they're not all there. Some of the carcasses were under, you know, were actually in the water, and there are like broken spears and things like this. So perhaps that's another context where we might say, well, maybe this is also to do with storing excess at this locale. And, you know, coming back to the question of traditions as well, you know, the fact that this seems to have happened over at least decades, that's a known place, which clearly this is a great place to hunt horses, and that's going to be generational. So the knowledge of a place that's good for hunting, and you combine it also with the potential that they may have been food storage of some kind going on. I don't think there's any great evidence that they were using like pits, like more sophisticated methods for fermenting food. I mean, as you know, if you look at the ethnography, there's some really out there ways of fermenting food, and, you know, mixing it, putting plants on, burying it for ages and all this. We don't really see Neanderthals digging pits very much. It's quite, or at least the evidence is very, very slim for that. So I don't really sort of envision that they would do that, but perhaps at the places where they actually killed the animals, maybe.
I guess too, in your depiction of the horses, it seems very plausible that they would have a good understanding of what happens if you pull the horse out of the water versus what happens if you leave the horse in the water, and that they were smart enough to control that in some way.
Oh, I would think so. I mean, some of the horse remains are on the shore, but some of them aren't. So, you know, it's very circumstantial. It's kind of, it's a bit fluffy, but in terms of sort of the Neanderthals' understanding of planning ahead for the future, that's really kind of what fermentation is about, isn't it? It's about expecting that you're going to come back to a place, because we have to remember they're very mobile, and they don't seem to have really been living anywhere more than a few weeks at most. So if you're fermenting, and that's a process that takes many weeks, months, then we would have to assume that they were expecting to return to a particular place over a time scale of maybe months, half a year, more. And although, as I said before, when you're talking about processes that were happening 50,000 years ago, and our time resolution is difficult, what we can see is that even, really sort of very small little rock shelters and things like this were still places that were persistently returned to. So I think the idea that they would expect to return somewhere and that there may have been resources left in that place for a future return is possible, although the evidence is quite, minimal, and you've got to kind of pick it out.
Well, so I think that takes me to my last question, because we've suddenly time has passed very quickly, and I want to save some time for other people's questions. But this is a two-parter. But first, I think one of the things that to me your book does so powerfully is to breathe humanity back into Neanderthals, and so I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about what to you personally most strikes you in terms of their humanity, in terms of or their Neanderthality, but their humanity. And then related to that, I think, what do we know now and think now about whether they were speaking to each other and what they might have been saying? And maybe then we'll close out on that and tip to people's questions. And so if you have questions out there, get them ready.
Well, it's always really difficult, like in terms of what makes us human is like is one of the biggest questions. In terms of things that make us different to other animals, even chimpanzees, it's generally to do with sort of a hyped upness in our cognition or our interaction with materials and things like this. But in terms of I guess people feeling an emotional connection to Neanderthals or humanity in that sense, we can see some degree of that in bonobos and chimpanzees in terms of like the intensity of their emotional bonds with each other, and sort of bringing it back to the question of food and plants and things. There's long been debate over whether Neanderthals cared for each other, and what's the evidence for any kind of medical care and things like this. And that's a really complicated topic again. Everything is with Neanderthals. But what we can see is that they had lives that were tough, and you see a lot of injuries and things, but not that much more than in comparable hunter-gatherer populations. People fall over a lot, it's difficult to hunt and things. There's not that much really strong evidence for violence between different individuals, but what we can see is that among individuals where there were severe injuries, like a broken femur, which is very serious, it completely reduces your mobility for a long time, or a really bad head injury, things like this. Those individuals survived after those injuries. They died of something else sometime later. There's a very famous Neanderthal from Shannon, or a different one than the one I mentioned before, who had like some terrible calamity before him, and he was really battered down one side and had a limp, missing his lower arm and all this, but he still survived and must have been provisioned with food in some way by group members, I would think. But the question of did they care for each other, it ties back into plants and things, because there's been some work again to do with the calculus between the teeth and pulling out different kinds of plants and things like this. And some of them, for example, yarrow has been found, and that's been claimed that perhaps that was actually for medicinal purposes. And as you talk about in your book, the issue about taste, reception and perceptors, and what chimpanzees do. Sometimes it's to do directly with health, and the impact on health. The question with Neanderthals and these herbs, and are they giving each other medicine or whatever? With plants, it's always tricky, because some of those are also actually used as herbs just for the taste. Yarrow is, that's in medieval recipes. Yarrow goes great with fish and things like this. So I think sort of we have to be careful how much we are sort of trying to project onto the data. But in terms of the basic evidence for care of individuals, I would expect that Neanderthals were far more similar to us than what we see in terms of chimpanzees, they will try and they recognize distress, and they will, you know, try and groom an injured individual, but there's not a lot of evidence for, like, you know, actual sort of care or bringing loads of food, unless it's like an infant, which you would expect. So yeah, no, it's complicated.
No, that's a good answer. I think that's yeah, inspires empathy in me, Neanderthal empathy. Well, so should we tip to the questions? This has been really wonderful, Becky, and I could talk to you about this for hours and hours, but I know other people have eventually things to do. So let's make sure people get a chance to ask some questions.
We have loads of questions, and I'll encourage folks, please keep them coming. Either in the Q&A box on Zoom, it's down on the bottom there. You'll see a little box called Q&A. Click on that, throw your questions in there, or on the YouTube, go ahead and throw it in the chat. I'm going to be real biased and start with Joshua Evans, who has hosted a fermentology talk in the past, who also has 3 questions here that I want to get to. Having to do with the horses in the lake that you were talking about before. How can you tell that where the water level was then versus now? Like, how do you make that calculation?
What you mean? Well, the lake is not a lake anymore. It's like buried under meters and meters and meters of deposits. But in terms of the level of the lake at the time, we can see that did change through different layers. But during that period where the horses were being hunted, we do believe that it was in standing water. I mean, but Schöningen is a really fascinating site, and I encourage people to read about it. And there are different phases of activity there, but during that particular phase with the horses and the spears, it does really look as if those carcasses, some of them were at the, you know, in the water, not far out in the middle of the lake,
Okay.
but, you know, not on the shore.
Right. And related to that, he was asking, is there a way for you to tell, you know, when these horses first came into contact with the water, either from the moment of being killed or possibly much later? What evidence is there to answer that question?
I don't think there is evidence for that. I don't think you can necessarily tell that at Schöningen, but like at Linford, as I said, there are carrion beetles for different kinds of meat, you know, like fresh meat versus weathered and stuff, and it does look as if some of it was underwater, and you know, it wasn't a massive sort of channel, so there was some water. But yeah, I mean, this is all sort of speculative, of course, in terms of what we're talking about with possible fermentation context. When I'm not saying for sure that these are sites where they were doing that, it's just, is there any possibility in any Neanderthal sites we have? And those were the ones that I would say maybe, you know.
Right. Yeah, I can guarantee that Joshua is just looking for a recipe, and he's gonna start throwing hunks of horse somewhere. Thanks, Joshua. Another question, going back to, you were talking about some of the tools, you mentioned a few tools and some of the stories. What other tools did they have available to them besides the spears and other potential cooking implements? What else did you find?
You mean just across all, in general?
Yeah, general.
Yeah, I mean, there is a massive variety in the stone tools. You know, we say, oh, stone tools, but there's huge diversity in how they made stuff and what they were doing with it, for one thing. But yes, we have some wooden tools. There's not very many of them because obviously the preservation is much more rare. So we have spears from a few sites. The Schöningen spears I mentioned do look like throwing spears. There's other sites where they look more like they might be thrusting. And there is a site called Neumark Nord from Germany. It's an interglacial site where it was warm, and the evidence there for spears is actually the holes in the bones on 2 fallow deer carcasses, which, you know, people have done sort of experiments, and basically they have to be spears, but they look like they were being thrusted, like from, you know, from up, from, you know, low. But other than that, we can see there are digging sticks, and those are really interesting, because you think, oh, digging sticks, yeah, whatever. But the same attention that is paid in the crafting of the spears, in terms of the choice of the wood and the way they actually are selecting the parts of the tree and things like this, we see something very similar in digging sticks, although they're not the same period, they're on the other side of Europe, but it's this attention to the materiality of the wood. And with the digging sticks, for example, they're choosing really hard woods, including boxwood. It takes hours to work that. And so for those, we can see they're using fire. And that makes complete sense. But then, like in other places, like we were talking before about possible culinary traditions in the Mediterranean in terms of the tortoises and things. I didn't even mention that there's loads of evidence from Mediterranean sites for them eating shellfish and seafood. Some of the sites in Greece and Italy, they use shells to actually nap, to make stone tools out of as well. So there is real diversity.
I love that tortoise story, because tortoises they bring their pot with them, don't they? Like, they're the perfect animal really to cook along.
Yeah.
Another question here, going back to those the cultural significance, right, of some of the behaviors that you see in Neanderthals. Somebody anonymous writes, is there any evidence of foodstuffs being included in Neanderthal graves?
Good question. There is very little evidence of any sort of stuff being included with what we believe to be intentionally deposited bodies. So, in the sediment fill around a body, there might be the odd bit of stone tool or whatever, but actually showing that was put in with a body is really, really hard. The one I can think of which may have that is a site called Amud, where there is a young child. This is in the Near East again, and there appeared to be a jaw of a deer that was either laid on the body of this child, or very close to it. It's basically right there, and it was more complete than most of the bones from that surrounding layer. So that's kind of suspicious.
Right.
But it's that kind of level of evidence that we have. Like, we don't have anything like the graves from the Upper Paleolithic after the Neanderthal, so Homo sapiens people, where they've got loads of stuff with them and they were clearly put in with the bodies. There's nothing like that that's as obvious.
And a question I have, I'm going to take the opportunity, because when am I going to get it again? But I'm always curious about, like, from behavioral ecology standpoints, looking at potentials for spandrel, effects. And I was really interested by the fact that you talk a lot about how really large animals are found near water or have this kind of water element to it. Are there also smaller kills that are involved there? Or is it possible that water was just an easy way to float and move things around? Once you've killed this big mammoth, how do you drag it, type thing?
I'm trying to think. Fallow deer are like medium sized. I'm trying to think about the interglacial sort of lake sites. There are other animals at Schöningen. There are medium sized animals there that they were eating as well. At Neumark Nord, it's kind of a bit of a mix of things. Again, that's medium sized. There's not like super good evidence for them taking on elephants there, although there is elsewhere in the region at the same period. No, I mean, it may well be that I think it's also linked with the kind of environments where we get lake sites preserved and the climatic periods when that happens, which tends to be warmer phase sites. And in those cases, lakes and water sources within forests are going to be magnets for all animals. You'll be following the game trails to find the animals. So it might be something to do with that. That's why the big animals are there, because that's just where all the predators are heading, as well as the Neanderthals.
Right, yeah, awesome. There are tons of questions here. I can't get to all of them, but folks, you can find Rebecca online, on Twitter. Any other places, Rebecca, that you want people to reach out to you?
I mostly am on Twitter. I'm at Lemoustier. I am actually on Instagram, but I only just joined, so I'm not very sort of, active. I just post pictures on there.
Nice. Yeah, I just joined TikTok a few days ago, and it's
Ah.
yeah, I know. But yeah, so for those of you who I wasn't able to get to your questions, please reach out to Rebecca there.
Well, I will say too, buy Rebecca's book
Yes.
because some of these are in there too. But these are really good questions. So what is there any evidence Neanderthals use salt? Is there any evidence? Why did they go
Salt.
extinct? Why did they go extinct?
Oh,
That's
well,
a
I can't do
longer
the
one.
extinct one in like 30 seconds, sorry. But it's probably not because of what they were eating that they were rubbish hunters. No. Salt is a very good question. Yeah, I mean, perhaps during coastal Neanderthals had found out that it tastes quite good. Who knows?
Yeah, if they're eating shellfish, they must have, or other marine animals, must have figured it out from there. Oh, fascinating. Well, if you love this talk, which I'm sure that you did, all the folks who've stuck around this afternoon, Monday, Rob and Rebecca are back, but this time they're joined with Anna Burgess Lumsden, and they're going to be cooking up actually Neanderthal-inspired dishes. So Joshua, that's one for you as well. And you can download the recipes and try them as well. And I'll throw a link in the chat right now so you can do that. You do not need to register for this talk. And I'll just say that again. You don't need to register for it because it's on YouTube. But the link that I've just thrown into the chats, you can add that YouTube easily to your calendar so you don't miss it. You just got to click on the YouTube link and go to it, and you'll see everybody there at 12:30 Eastern Time here on Monday, April 19th. And with that, thank you both so much for your time and sharing all of your expertise with us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Thanks so much, Becky. Thanks, Michelle. Thank you.